Imagine for a second that you are a standard infantry soldier back in 1861.
Oh, man. Yeah, not a great time to be in the infantry.
Right. Because you're standing on a battlefield, and to just return fire, you have to execute this incredibly terrifying, vulnerable sequence. You physically tear open a paper cartridge with your teeth.
Yep, literally biting the bullet, so to speak.
Exactly. You bite it open, you pour this loose black powder down a long metal tube, insert a lead ball, draw out your ramrod, and then shove the whole payload all the way down to the bottom of the barrel.
And you're doing all of this while standing entirely exposed to enemy fire.
Yes, you are completely out in the open. And under perfect conditions, if your hands aren't shaking too badly, you might manage to fire maybe 3 shots in a single minute.
3 shots a minute. That was the gold standard.
But then imagine doing that and looking across the field and seeing a machine that is capable of firing 350 rounds a minute.
It's just an unfathomable leap.
It really is. That monumental shift in warfare didn't take a century of slow, methodical evolution. It happened in a mere 15-year window.
Yeah, that 15-year window just completely rewrote the rules of engagement.
Yeah.
But what makes this era so vital to study isn't just the sheer velocity of the engineering.
Right, there's a whole human element to it.
Exactly. It is the collision between that rapid technological leap and a deeply entrenched institutional stubbornness. I mean, the technology raced ahead at breakneck speed, but the people commanding the military actively decided to hit the brakes.
Which brings us to our topic. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are unpacking the stunning technological evolution of firearms between 1861 and 1876.
It is such a fascinating timeline.
It really is. And to do this, we're looking at this brilliant historical analysis called strategic obsolescence, Ordnance Doctrine, and the Little Bighorn.
That source is just incredible for breaking down the why behind the military's choices.
So our mission today is to trace how a massive leap in ordnance technology was, well, basically bottlenecked by military bureaucracy, and how that ultimately culminated in the chaotic and tragic events at the Battle of the Little Bighorn.
Which is also known to the Lakota and Cheyenne as the Battle of the Greasy Grass.
Right. So to understand the disaster that unfolded on the banks of the Little Bighorn River, we have to ground ourselves in that initial baseline.
Yeah, that 1861 baseline. When the American Civil War breaks out, that muzzle-loading process you just described, that's the global standard.
Right, the 3 shots a minute rhythm.
Exactly. 3 shots a minute was the rhythm of war. But in that exact same year, 1861, an inventor named Richard Gatling builds a device that just shatters that rhythm completely.
The Gatling Gun. I mean, he creates this heavy hand-cranked weapon with multiple rotating barrels, and the specs on this thing are almost unimaginable for the mid-19th century.
Yeah, it really sounds like science fiction for the time.
We are talking about firing 350 massive .45 70 caliber rounds every 60 seconds. That isn't an incremental upgrade.
No, not at all.
That is like leaping from dial-up internet straight to fiber optic broadband overnight. The sheer whiplash of that technological leap is staggering.
It was a terrifying innovation, absolutely. But, it was also a total mechanical nightmare out in the field.
Really? Just because the tech was too new?
Well, the fundamental issue is actually the propellant. In 1861, weapons relied heavily on black powder. Modern smokeless powder, it converts almost entirely into gas when it burns, but black powder is highly inefficient.
Oh, so it leaves a mess behind.
A huge mess. When it combusts, about half of its mass remains behind as a solid particulate. It's this thick, sludgy carbon residue.
Oh, wow. So if you were cranking 350 rounds a minute through this complex rotating mechanism.
Yep, you're rapidly filling the inner workings of that gun with thick, corrosive tar.
That sounds like a recipe for a jam.
It was. The mechanism would literally choke on its own waste. The fouling caused all that intricate gearing to bind and jam constantly.
So it wasn't exactly reliable in the heat of battle.
Far from it. And beyond the mechanical failure, there was a really glaring tactical vulnerability too. Because to support the weight of those rotating barrels and the heavy ammunition hoppers, these guns had to be mounted high up.
Like on carriages.
Right, on heavy, horse-drawn artillery carriages.
Oh, I see. Meaning the crew operating them can't just lie prone in the dirt to stay safe?
No, not at all. To turn that crank and feed the hopper, the battery crew has to stand completely upright behind this massive, incredibly loud machine.
You are effectively building a billboard that tells enemy sharpshooters exactly where to aim.
Precisely. The crew became entirely exposed targets. So while the rapid-fire concept was definitely proven, the actual application was, well, it was clunky.
But the genie was out of the bottle at that point.
Exactly. By the end of the Civil War, engineers had figured out how to put that rapid-fire capability into the hands of an individual soldier. Which brings us to the advent of the lever-action repeating rifle.
Like the Henry and the Spencer rifles.
Yes, the Henry and the Spencer. Those completely changed the geometry of the firearm.
Because instead of loading one bullet at a time into the breech, these weapons feature a tubular magazine, right, running underneath the barrel.
Right, and it holds multiple self-contained metallic cartridges just lined up nose to tail.
So a soldier simply racks a lever down and back, that single motion drops a lifter block, ejects the spent brass casing, and then slides a fresh cartridge directly into the chamber.
It's so efficient. It allowed a single soldier to fire up to 16 shots in seconds without ever having to lower the weapon from their shoulder.
That is a massive advantage.
Huge. The metallic cartridge combined with that repeating mechanism, it fundamentally altered the lethal potential of a single combatant.
So logically, you would assume the United States military would immediately recognize this, right? Like, equip every cavalryman with the most advanced 16-shot repeating rifle available.
You would think so, yeah. But that brings us to the 1872 Army Ordnance Board.
Ah, the bureaucracy enters the chat.
Always. This was a panel of military experts, and notably, it included Major Marcus Reno and General Alfred Terry.
Wait, two commanders who would soon find themselves at the Little Bighorn?
The very same. So they were tasked with selecting the standard-issue firearm for the U.S. Army. They tested these cutting-edge lever-action repeaters extensively, and they actively rejected them. They actually dismissed them as, quote, underpowered novelty weapons.
Wait, let me pause and make sure we have this straight for everyone listening. You have 16-shot repeating rifles available, and they are proven in combat.
Yes.
But the highest military command intentionally rejects them to adopt a gun that fires one bullet at a time.
That is exactly what they did. They selected the Springfield Model 1873 carbine instead. This was a breech-loading, single-shot rifle.
Okay, so how did that work?
Well, a soldier had to flip open a trapdoor mechanism, manually insert a single cartridge, close the trapdoor, fire, extract the casing, and start all over again.
My immediate instinct is to look at the budget here, because I know the government already owned the patent for the Springfield's trapdoor mechanism, so that would make it incredibly cheap to produce at existing armories, right?
Yeah.
Especially during a period of severe post-war budget cuts.
Cost was definitely a factor, yeah. But treating this as mere spreadsheet logic kind of misses the deeper philosophy driving the military at the time. And this is really the core thesis of strategic obsolescence.
Okay, lay it on me.
The Ordnance Board's decision was rooted in a rigid, deeply ingrained tactical doctrine known as fire discipline.
Fire discipline, meaning they essentially didn't trust their own soldiers not to panic.
Precisely. The dominant military doctrine was obsessed with symmetrical warfare. The generals were planning for a massive clash against fully equipped European armies,
Right.
or perhaps another large-scale American civil conflict involving tens of thousands of troops. And in that specific scenario, logistics dictate survival.
Oh, because of ammunition supply lines.
Yes. If you hand a terrified soldier a repeating rifle, the prevailing fear was that they would just spray and pray, that they'd fire all 16 rounds in the first 2 minutes of an engagement before the horse-drawn supply trains could ever hope to resupply them.
So the single-shot Springfield acts as a kind of mechanical governor on the soldiers' panic. It forces them to slow down, pick their targets, and conserve ammunition.
Exactly. Plus, the Springfield fired a much heavier cartridge with far more black powder than the repeaters could handle.
Which gave it superior range and stopping power, I'm guessing.
Right. On a traditional open battlefield, it had great range. The logic holds together perfectly, provided you are actually fighting a conventional European army on an open field.
But the U.S. military was not fighting a European army. They were engaged in the Plains Indian Wars.
Right. A highly mobile, close-quarters, guerrilla-style conflict against Lakota and Cheyenne warriors.
And the military establishment viewed this frontier conflict as just a minor sideshow, didn't they?
They really did. They believed that a disciplined, professional soldier with a long-range single-shot weapon could easily outmatch any indigenous force. They designed their standard weaponry for the war they wanted to fight.
While entirely blinding themselves to the tactical realities of the war they were actually fighting, that doctrinal blindness creates a ticking time bomb.
A deadly one.
Because while Washington planners are theorizing about European battlefields, the 7th Cavalry has to ride into the harsh realities of the American West in the 1876 campaign.
Yeah, and out in the field, The sources revealed that the single-shot Springfield possessed a catastrophic metallurgical flaw.
Oh, right, the copper casings.
Yes, the Springfield carbine fired a .4555 caliber metallic cartridge. However, to save money, the casing of that cartridge was manufactured out of copper.
And copper is a highly malleable metal.
Very soft. When it is cool, it feeds into the chamber perfectly. The basic physics dictates that copper expands significantly when subjected to high heat.
And the chamber of a rifle gets incredibly hot during a sustained firefight.
It does. As a trooper fired multiple rounds, the chamber heated up, causing the soft copper casing to expand. It would essentially swage itself into the microscopic imperfections of the steel chamber walls.
Oh, man. And then you reintroduce that heavy, sticky carbon fouling caused by the black powder we discussed earlier.
Exactly. The copper casing becomes literally glued to the inside of the gun.
So the soldier flips open the trapdoor and engages the extractor, which is just this small steel mechanism designed to grab the rim of the cartridge and pull it out. But the casing is stuck fast.
Right, so the steel extractor would simply rip right through the soft rim of the copper head. It just tears it off completely.
Leaving the body of the casing firmly jammed inside the chamber, which instantly turns a high-powered cavalry rifle into an 8-pound club.
Pretty much. You cannot load the next round.
So what's the fix?
The only way to clear the weapon is to drop to the ground, pull out a pocket knife, and frantically try to pry a superheated, stuck copper tube out of the breech manually.
That is terrifying.
Archaeological surveys of the battlefield indicate that this extraction failure rate was roughly 1 in 30 firings.
1 in 30. I mean, in a sterile report back in Washington, an extraction failure rate of roughly 3% might sound statistically acceptable.
Especially compared to the constant misfire rates of the old muzzle loaders.
Right. But statistics don't account for human psychology. Put yourself on a dusty ridge, surrounded by an overwhelming force. The man to your left suddenly drops his rifle and starts digging frantically at the breech with a pocket knife.
The panic that sight induces is contagious. It absolutely shatters unit cohesion.
So George Armstrong Custer and the 7th Cavalry are heading into hostile territory armed with these single-shot rifles that are prone to jamming when they get hot.
Yep.
This raises a massive tactical question regarding the days leading up to the battle, because General Terry offered Custer additional firepower before the march up Rosebud Creek toward the Little Bighorn, didn't he?
He did. He offered him a battery of Gatling guns.
And Custer flatly refused them.
He turned them down.
If you know your men are armed with vulnerable single-shot rifles, why on earth do you leave your heaviest, fastest-firing artillery behind?
Custer's refusal is deeply rooted in his absolute obsession with mobility. He firmly believed that the primary challenge of the campaign wouldn't be fighting the Lakota and Cheyenne, but merely catching them before they could scatter.
So he wanted a fast column.
He demanded a flying column that could travel fast and light. The Gatling guns were mounted on massive artillery carriages, as we talked about, and they were being pulled by condemned horses.
Condemned horses?
Meaning horses that were sick, exhausted, or basically deemed unfit for regular cavalry mounts.
So they would act as a massive logistical anchor just dragging behind the regiment.
Exactly. Major Marcus Reno had just taken a Gatling gun on a scouting mission a few weeks prior, and it was a nightmare over that broken terrain. The guns constantly had to be unlimbered and manhandled across deep ravines by the soldiers themselves.
That sounds exhausting.
It was. Furthermore, during the 1874 Black Hills expedition, Custer had personally witnessed a Gatling gun flip over on a steep incline, roll down a mountain, and completely shatter. So he knew exactly how cumbersome they were in this specific topography.
He prioritized speed over firepower. He was just so confident. I think he declared to Terry, the 7th can handle anything it meets.
He really assumed the shock and awe of a fast-moving cavalry charge would just scatter any village. He fundamentally underestimated both the size of the force he was about to engage and their technological capability.
Which brings us to the absolute collision of all these strategic choices on June 25th, 1876. The 7th Cavalry rides into the valley of the Little Bighorn River.
And they are uniformly armed with those single-shot Springfields and Colt revolvers.
Custer had even ordered his men to leave their sabers behind in boxes to save weight and eliminate the noise of clanking metal during the march, right?
Yep, they committed entirely to a very specific lightweight style of engagement.
But the village they encounter along the greasy grass is unlike anything the military had anticipated.
Not at all what they expected.
Driven together by encroaching settlements, bands of Hunkpapa, Oglala, Cheyenne, and others had formed an enormous multi-tribal encampment stretching for miles. and they were fiercely motivated to defend their families.
Absolutely. Now, the military bureaucracy had assumed this force would be armed primarily with traditional bows and outdated muzzle-loading Lehman trade guns.
And to be fair, many of the warriors were armed with traditional weapons, right?
Yes, to be clear, many were. And a seasoned warrior with the traditional bow was devastatingly effective at 30 yards. But here is where the technological whiplash comes back with a vengeance.
The repeaters.
Yes, about 10% of the warriors, which is roughly 200 fighters, were armed with state-of-the-art lever-action repeating rifles.
Wow. We are talking about the Winchester model 1866 and the Henry repeating rifle.
The exact same 16-shot technology the Ordnance Board had dismissed as an underpowered novelty.
But wait, how does a massive indigenous force actively being hunted by the U.S. government acquire hundreds of state-of-the-art repeating rifles and metallic cartridges to feed them? I mean, they don't have dedicated factory supply lines.
No, they didn't. They acquired them through a complex, deeply corrupt network of post-traders, gun runners, and intermediaries. Warriors would trade horses, mules, or buffalo hides for these weapons and ammunition.
Just trading for the best tech available.
Exactly. And the darkest irony of this entire conflict is that many of those weapons flowed directly from government-licensed traders.
This ties into the Belknap scandal, doesn't it?
It does. The Secretary of War, William Belknap, oversaw a system where lucrative trading post licenses were granted through immense corruption and bribery. Belknap was actually impeached over this corruption just months before the battle.
Didn't Custer himself travel to Washington to testify about that?
He did. Custer testified about the rot in the system. The government's own licensed traders were turning massive profits by selling the most advanced repeating rifles to the very people the Army was trying to subdue.
So the U.S. government's institutional arrogance deemed the repeating rifle useless for its own soldiers, while its own corrupt bureaucracy essentially crowdfunded the enemy's technological upgrade.
It's tragic. The Native American warriors recognized the devastating power of rapid fire immediately. They were the early adopters.
And at the Little Bighorn, that technological discrepancy became fatal.
It did. And we can actually map the exact tactical impact of that discrepancy through modern archaeology.
Oh, from the metal detector surveys.
Yes. Our sources detail extensive metal detector surveys conducted at a specific location on the battlefield known as Calhoun Hill. Archaeologists discovered a highly concentrated grouping of Henry rifle cartridge casings in one specific area.
The concentration was so dense they dubbed the site Henryville, right?
Exactly.
Henryville.
So what do the forensics of Henryville actually tell us about the final moments of Lieutenant Calhoun's L Company? The forensic distribution shows that a group of about 20 warriors, armed with Henry rifles, positioned themselves at that location. Now, 20 repeating rifles can put an astonishing amount of lead into the air in a matter of seconds.
Just a wall of bullets.
They unleashed a localized barrage of rapid fire that created overwhelming panic among the cavalrymen. You have troopers armed with single-shot Springfields, terrified that their copper cartridges are going to jam, suddenly facing a continuous, unrelenting wall of lead.
It shatters the doctrine of fire discipline completely.
Absolutely.
The psychological weight of that firepower causes the skirmish lines to completely disintegrate. The soldiers break, cohesion collapses, and they flee. The so-called novelty weapon completely dismantled the professional cavalry line.
The Army's doctrine of long-range, disciplined, single-shot fire completely crumbled the moment it faced a highly motivated enemy, employing close-quarters rapid fire. The strategic obsolescence of their ordnance doctrine was exposed in the most brutal, undeniable way possible.
When you trace this 15-year journey from 1861 to 1876, the sheer arrogance of it is just astounding.
It really is.
We go from soldiers biting paper cartridges to the birth of the 350-round-a-minute Gatling gun to the lever-action repeater, and yet the military bureaucracy actively chose to ignore the reality right in front of them because they were obsessed with a hypothetical war that didn't exist.
It stands as a timeless study in how institutions fail to adapt. They become wedded to a specific doctrine, a specific vision of how things should operate based on past experiences.
Yeah, they get comfortable.
Right. They build their budgets and their strategies around that comfort zone, entirely blinding themselves to the disruptive realities shifting the ground beneath their feet.
Which is a profound cautionary tale for you, no matter what field you are in. Think about it. How often do you or the organization you work for cling to the standard way of doing things simply because it's what you prepared for?
It happens all the time.
How often do you ignore a massive technological shift happening right in front of you because your internal spreadsheets and doctrines tell you it's just a novelty? The Army Ordnance Board looked at the future of warfare, said, no thanks, we'll stick to one bullet at a time, and paid the ultimate price for that arrogance.
And if you want a final thought to really illustrate the cost of that arrogance, look back at the origins of those repeating rifles at the greasy grass.
But trading posts.
Yes. The U.S. Army was defeated, in part, by the advanced technology their own corrupt system had sold to the Lakota and Cheyenne. Consider the implications of that for a second. What happens when the disruptive tools you stubbornly refuse to adopt are eagerly picked up by your competitors?
And your own broken system is the one that inadvertently handed them over. That is a haunting question to leave you with. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the crosshairs of technology and history. We hope this exploration of the 1876 Ordnance Revolution gives you a new perspective on how quickly the world can change and the fatal cost of refusing to change with it. Until next time, keep questioning the standard way of doing things.
And keep exploring the history behind the headlines.